thank you for your continued interest in conservative outreach on climate policy. Your voice is important, and we've designed some talks here that we hope will help you engage your voice. By the end of next Tuesday, you will see a link in your inbox if you registered for the conference with the talks and the slides linked to that is particularly important for Shannon's slides that he'll be sharing. If you have questions, please write them into the chat and send them to an Ask Me Todd or Ask Me Amanda for queuing up for consideration. You are in the right place to hear Shannon Caraway with an optimistic vision for our energy future, where that you will learn to share the benefits of climate policy. It is a true pleasure for me to introduce Shannon to you. For those of you that don't know him, he is uniquely qualified to talk about the energy industry in the United States and how carbon pricing will impact electric generation. Shannon has a master's and bachelor's in electrical engineering, an MBA, and he has applied those while working at TXU Energy and Illuminate Energy in Texas, and most recently as Vice President of Solar Prime, utility scale solar project development company focused in the Southwest United States of America. So with that, Shannon, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jim. Well, I want to come to you today and really share what I believe is an optimistic vision around the energy transition that's ahead of us. And it's one that really there's 3 points to this talk. It's optimism and why I've developed that optimism over the last 5 years. It's around technology, showing you the technology that I believe we already have to address the climate change issue, crisis that we've got. And then one of abundance, illustrating how HR 763 will actually create more US jobs, plentiful energy, and support a growing economy, because those are all areas of concern, I think, for many on our side of the political aisle. So one of the first things I think is important is defining the challenge and trying to get a shared vision around shared understanding of what that challenge looks like, and then how our solutions could play out for that. So one of the things that's a great model out there is the En-ROADS model by Climate Interactive and the MIT Management Sustainability Initiative. And if you could go Google that if you haven't used it in the past. It's a great tool to be able to look at kind of baseline scenario we have and test out different solutions. If we look at the top left of this, really what we see is that fossil fuels continue to grow just grow constantly through the next 40 to 80 years on the trajectory that we're on. And what goes with that is shown on the right, the temperature change that's just growing year after year after year as we put more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere that have the heat trapping effect. And so the model shows on a baseline scenario, we're headed towards a 4.1 degrees C above industrial levels by 2100. And that's the challenge that's in front of us. One of the nice things about the model is you can dial in different specific things and see what type of impact that the model believes it has on the overall challenge in front of us. So what I've done in this one is I've tried to model out pricing carbon. If we look here at number 1 at the bottom via HR 763. So I started at $15 a ton, grow at $10 a ton per year as that bill does. And then if you look at number 2, you see what we see occurring is coal generation is replaced with natural gas and renewables. And one thing I want to be clear of, for those of you who've used the model, I have specifically dialed in, shown here kind of in the little square box, a phase out of all coal over a 10-year period. The model itself from pricing carbon does not do that completely, but from my time and experience in industry, and for reasons I will show you in the rest of the presentation, I do truly believe that's the outcome that we see for sure. And so I've tried to model that, and I don't want anyone that's used to using this model to not know that's there. If we really ramp up the use, though, of natural gas and replace coal, one of the important things is controlling methane leakage, because methane emitted into the atmosphere is even worse than CO2. So I've dialed in a highly reduced methane control, and I want to be clear that that's important. Electrifying transport is very important if we are truly to get to 2 °C outcome. That is dialed in as well, as long with some increase in efficiency and electrifying more buildings and industry. You dial those things in, and the model shows us we're at a 2 °C outcome by 2100, as shown on the page here. There's an infinite number of combinations you could put in to try to get there. This is one that I'm looking at. All right, before we look forward, it's important to provide a little bit of a historical perspective around technology improvement and market forces. We've already seen it work in our market because I think they help ground us in thinking about what's truly possible going forward by creating a little broader awareness of what already has occurred. To do that and to get started with this, I want to introduce you to a concept known as Wright's Law, or otherwise known as the learning curve. Wright's Law was developed back during World War II when they were looking at the cost reductions that they saw in manufacturing airplanes for the war. The more they produced, the cheaper they were able to get them. And so Wright's Law, it says that the cost of a unit decreases as a function of cumulative production. So I'm showing you a chart on the right for two technologies, and we'll look at more later. One of them is solar photovoltaic modules, and the other one is lithium-ion battery packs. And so what we see for solar photovoltaic modules, they've experienced a 24% learning curve over a very long period of time. This is like 40 years that's shown there. And battery storage, 22%. It's over a little shorter period, but you're seeing a similar trend. The implication of this is that the more units produced, the lower prices get. Think about flat screen TVs. That's one that we've all seen in the last 20 years. It follows this same type of trend. Okay, everything experiences some form of learning rate. So if we're going to really understand it for the power, the electricity sector, it's really important to look at it more broadly. So what I've prepared here, a table on the right, and I've put this together for the most common power generation technologies and for their associated fuel extraction that supports that power generation where there's been meaningful improvements in technology, primarily natural gas on that side. And then I provide the combined learning rate on the right. What we see, the observations from this, is nuclear and coal are being outcompeted by natural gas, solar, and wind. The physical drivers around it is nuclear. Safety regulations have really continued very realistically and importantly, they've gone up as we know more, like Fukushima. We've had other things that's driven us in that direction, but cost has gone up as a result. Coal is a very mature technology, so it has a pretty low learning rate at this point of about 8%. But natural gas, solar, and wind, it's a very different story. Natural gas, when you look at the combined cycle generation technology combined with the shale fracking, it's experienced a 25% combined learning rate. For solar PV, massive global growth, first in Germany and California and China, has driven down cost, and it's experienced a 23% learning rate under this study here. And then wind, the increasing height of turbines, that type of thing, has allowed it to experience a 14% learning rate. Okay, so that's Wright's Law, the learning rate for all these different technologies. Let's look at those at work in the industry. The graph I've got on the right, it's a little bit busy, but this is a graph out of a Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, their Energy Market and Policy Group, and they looked at a little over 600 solar and wind power purchase agreements. And the size of the circles is how big the project was. The centroid of the circle is the price. So what they've seen is over a 12-year period from 2008 to 2019, solar has decreased, power purchase agreements for this has decreased 87%. Wind over that period has decreased at 83%. Natural gas, the fuel alone, so this is just the fuel component, has decreased 50% when they're looking at a 20-year forward projection of price from the EIA. Okay, if we then try to look at the market forces at work in the entire electricity sector, and again, I'm looking at the same 12-year period. One of the first things you see if you look at the bottom left is over 12 years, the amount of electricity consumption in the country is flat. There's been no increase, no decrease. It's been amazingly flat. When you look at the graph on the right, The things you see is that coal, which peaked at 2007, 2008 time period, has fallen precipitously. We today, in fact, if you look at the table on the left, we have 51% less coal production or less coal consumption for power in 2019 than we did in 2008. It'd be even a little more than that if I indexed it to 2007, which was the peak. We do see that natural gas grew nearly 80% from a much lower base across that same period, and renewables grew at nearly 90% against a much lower base as well. And petroleum, which was already at nearly negligible levels, fell 60%. There's very little oil used in the power generation space. Okay, so let's think then about, if that's overall megawatt hours, let's look at CO2 emissions. Across this same period, what we've seen is a dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions. If we look at the lower part of the table, over 12 years, CO2 emissions have reduced 32% from 2008 baseline to 2019. Before I say more, imagine for a moment if we were rewinding time and we were at the end of 2007 and they said in 12 years from now, we've got to reduce CO2 emissions by 32%. Is somebody working in the industry at that time? I would have thought that probably wasn't possible. Certainly wasn't cost competitively possible. Yet here we are, and it's actually happened. And so we see what has driven that is natural gas has come down dramatically in price. Natural gas, as we saw earlier, has come down in price. And so while CO2 from coal has dropped 50%, it's increased 71% from a much smaller base for natural gas. And then all of the renewables growth has actually doesn't contribute CO2 emissions. We put all that together and we've got the 32% drop that's actually occurred in 12 years. Half of our coal emissions are already gone. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit and look at this in the entire economy. If we look at the entire economy in the US, CO2 emissions are down 12% in the entire economy, but all of that decrease has come from the electricity sector. Transport has been essentially flat, and then other uses, other emitters of CO2 have actually grown some. So it's really the electricity sector where we've had the opportunity to decarbonize and have been able to do so mainly due to what technology has done for us. Okay, with that look in the rearview mirror, kind of establishing what's possible and how it has occurred, let's look at the road ahead. What we really need is massive commercialization of existing technology. That's the key to decarbonizing. It's not like we need a new drug or a new miracle to make this happen. We have the technologies today. We just need to start massively deploying them. So if we look at a high-level roadmap of how this decarbonization would work, there's really two principal components. First is decarbonizing the grid, and here I mean the electricity grid, and electrifying everything to take advantage of this decarbonized grid. So in the decarbonize the grid, the remaining coal generation has to retire because of its high emissions of CO2. And it will be replaced by natural gas and renewables, and we must retain the existing nuclear generation. It provides 20% of our electricity in the country, and it's CO2 emissions free. We can't afford to lose that, certainly not for a long time. And then we need to electrify everything. We need to electrify transport, home heating. We got to decrease carbon emissions in all these other sectors, and that can occur even if today's generation mix, if those are converted to being electrically powered, net emissions of CO2 comes down. And this becomes even more pronounced as the grid's decarbonized. Okay, so let's look at decarbonizing the grid. Let's drill into that a little bit. On the traditional generation front, coal has 2.5 times the CO2 emissions that natural gas does. When I'm looking at a natural gas combined cycle power generation plant compared to a pulverized coal steam turbine. Replacing all this coal with natural gas alone. So if we just converted the remaining coal to only natural gas, no renewables, it would reduce CO2 emissions in the US power sector another 37%. Now, I do not believe we only replace coal with natural gas. I believe the cost competitiveness of everything, it'll be a combination of that, ramping up more. There's a lot of the capacity factor of most gas units in the country on average, somewhere around 50%. So there's room for that to ramp up as coal's retired. And then on the renewable generation front, I see that solar and storage are already cheaper than new gas-fired generation. So the majority of all new generation will actually be that it's built will be solar, wind, and battery storage, in my opinion, looking at the economics. All right, so who probably speaks the most on this type of thing? It's Elon Musk. So one of the kind of the myths I hear that really comes from lack of knowledge, and I used to have a lack of knowledge of this myself, is that solar, we don't even really, if that's where we're going, there ain't room for all of that. You couldn't power the country that way. So Elon Musk, a few years ago, in a speech to the National Governors Association, he said, what if we were to go to the bookend and we powered the entire US by solar and battery storage? That's it. Nothing else, only that. Now, he wasn't advocating that's where you get to right away but he's saying if you did that, you'd need a 100-mile by 100-mile area in the desert Southwest and a 1-mile by 1-mile area for the battery storage, 100 by 100 for the solar and the 1 by 1 for the battery storage. I've modeled out my own modeling around the solar, and I get an answer very close to what he gets. I do want to be on record. I don't believe this is what happens. I believe we have a generation mix, but what this does, especially if you know those areas well, is it debunks that myth of we don't have space for this. Okay, the Electrify Everything piece. The Union of Concerned Scientists, one of the things they've done is every few years they put out a report around EV emissions as a gasoline miles per hour equivalent, EVs being electric vehicles. Most recently, they put one together for their efficient car scenario. It had a Tesla Model 3 that they used for that. And what they saw is over an 80% less greenhouse gas emissions out of a Tesla Model 3, even with the existing electricity grid that we have now, with the power generation mix we have now, compared to the average new gasoline car, and a 60% less greenhouse gas emissions than the most efficient gasoline car. What they found is the US average would be the equivalent of a 115 mile per gallon gasoline car from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. And as the grid is decarbonized, this keeps getting better, even if the electric car mix stays the same, because the fuel that they're using, electricity, is getting more decarbonized. Shannon, this is great. You're talking to me about something that only rich people could afford. I mean, how can somebody else, how could I afford an electric car? They're just too expensive. Well, that too had truth to it not that many years ago. In fact, I liked electric cars long before I could afford one or chose to buy one. But what we've seen is we've had a decade of progress in that area as well. And so this table shows you here, it's a 5-year cost of ownership model that's been put together, and it was published very recently. But a Tesla Model 3 came out over a 5-year period, 46 cents a mile. A Toyota Camry, hardly something anyone thinks of as only for the rich, came in at 49 cents a mile. What makes it cheaper is it's primarily due to the low cost of operations. There's not oil changes, there's not air filters, there's not all of these things that you have to do in the same way you do in a gasoline car. And they also deliver superior performance. As an owner of a Tesla Model 3, I'll tell you this thing called a Tesla Smile, it's because they're darn fun to drive as well. So the superior economics, and then honestly, the bonus, superior performance. Okay, so let's look a little broader at the growing ecosystem around electric vehicles. High-speed charging is really something that Tesla has shown us first and foremost how to accomplish. Now Electrify America is doing that. But the Tesla supercharger network has over 16,000 high-speed chargers across the country, all along the major interstates and highways. Electrify America, which has started much more recently, they already have nearly 2,000 chargers. So for myself, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I travel to Houston, Austin, different areas on business, use my car. travel and high-speed charging works out very well, and there's really no place I feel like I can't go. As we look forward, really in just the next few years, in the medium and heavy-duty trucks, I've shown the Tesla examples, but there's a whole industry, you know, Rivian, GM, Ford, others doing that very soon. And then same way in trucks, Peterbilt and other companies are doing that besides Tesla. And then the extreme sports cars. There's some really just amazing cars about to come to market. But we see most, you know, in these trucks, 300 to 500 miles of range. Sports cars, Tesla's saying 600 miles of range. So there's a growing ecosystem around all of that. Well, that's ground-based transport. Let's look a little broader than that. I'll take you to the bottom right here. One of my good friends is Peter Brin. In fact, he's the person that got me involved with CCL. He's actually working on a project to support the Washington State ferry system. They're the second largest in the world, and they're sourcing 19 hybrid drive ferries from Vigar Shipbuilders and ABB. So here's an example where that's being applied to the shipping and the marine industry. And then I've shown you pictures here of Boeing, Airbus, and some other startups like Evation. And they're showing us that the future is electric in aerospace industry as well, as the energy density of these batteries keeps coming down. So you get the same benefits that we see on ground-based transport in these areas as well. But you know, there's really even a broader electrification than that. Look at today's conference. We're doing this as a virtual conference over Zoom. This same time last year, we all flew to Washington, D.C. for this conference. I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be probably 100x less emissions that we're producing just to do this conference than it was last year. And so that's something, certainly in the last 3 months, we've all got a lot more experience with that. And then you see the efficiency things we're all familiar with in our homes, to where we can continue to use our energy more efficiently there. Okay, if we're going to avert the climate crisis, though, as much as I'm optimistic with these technologies, you can't continue to emit emissions for free and get this done in the time period that we need to. So it requires speeding up the transition, and you have to price CO2 equivalent emissions in order to let the economics work out the way they're supposed to. So I show you here HR 763. I think we're all pretty familiar with this. The three main components is there's a fee on carbon emission equivalents, starting at $15 a ton, increasing to $10 a ton a year after that. There's a dividend that distributes revenues to all Americans, and then there's a border adjustment component where carbon border fee is placed on imports, and it's refunded for exports out of our country to keep us so we don't really export jobs to other countries that aren't doing the right thing here. There's a very similar proposal by the Climate Leadership Council called carbon dividends. It's very similar to the carbon fee and dividend one. And when we look at industry support there's all these corporate founding members on the left. I'd call your attention to two of the big three automakers, Ford and GM are in there, as well as other really large companies we're familiar with. But then let's look at the top right on the energy founding members. 4 of the 5 oil and gas super majors are founding members of this proposal. 3 of the 4 large power generation companies in the country, including my former employer, Vistra Energy, are a part of this as well. And then we've got various conservation organizations that support it as well. So this is not, these are people, this is what they do for a living, and they believe this is possible, and they support this. And then there's really strong economist support for this. There's over 3,500 US economists that have signed up to support carbon dividends, including 4 former Fed chairs, 27 Nobel laureates, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. Okay, with that, let's head into the home stretch here. Unlocking the abundance. Abundant energy, abundant jobs, and a growing economy. Let's think about how HR 763 changes the energy mix. On the existing electric generation, as I said earlier, coal emits 2.5 times the CO2 emissions of natural gas. So what we see, as soon as we price this out, all coal-fired generation in the US quickly retires. Natural gas generation that's already there ramps up from that 50% capacity factor I talked about earlier. And very importantly, our nuclear generation is retained because it begins to get paid for its carbon-free attribute. On the oil and gas side, oil and natural gas side, natural gas demand surges as coal retires. Now, I know some see that as, well, that's terrible. I don't want that to happen. But think about what I said earlier. Natural gas in a combined cycle combustion turbine, replacing coal alone, 37% coal emission reduction. So we see an initial surge, as I'll talk about more for that reason, the economics around this. And the demand for low CO2 oil surges as well. And then lastly, in the renewables and electric transport sector, solar, wind, and energy storage will accelerate significantly. Electrification of transport will as well. So let's further unpack this coal to natural gas demand increase that I talked about a while ago. I've modeled out year 3 of the carbon fee and dividend at $35 a ton. I worked through all of that. Coal gets $35 a megawatt hour more expensive. Natural gas, $13 a megawatt hour more expensive for combined cycle, creating this $22 a megawatt hour difference. So all coal-fired generation quickly retires because coal has been retiring even when carbon wasn't priced. Half of it's gone. The other half goes even quicker. The market impacts is natural gas demand surges as coal retires. My calculations is back around that replacing all coal with natural gas. I just did this a couple of days ago using 2019 as a baseline. We'd see a 22% increase in natural gas demand nationwide associated with that transition. Here's one that we don't all often think about, though, is the surge in demand for low CO2 oil. Global demand for oil will decrease due to the CO2 fee. It's just common sense. But low CO2 demand will actually increase. Not all oil is created the same. What this chart shows you here is the CO2 intensity of different oils around the globe with a 14% global average. But look at the US Gulf of Mexico at 9%. And the ideal Permian Basin at 11%. And the ideal is really the reduction of flaring that's was occurring before all the pipelines got built. So what we see is the United States actually enjoys an advantage globally for low CO2 oil. And that's something that not everyone's thinking about. Okay, then let's talk about the jobs piece. There is clearly a pain in the transition around coal jobs. What I've put together here to kind of put all this in perspective is the total jobs in the power generation and fuel space in the country. So we have about 800,000 jobs in power generation. There's about another 180,000 jobs in the fuels that support them, so for their fuel component, and total employment of just under 1 million jobs in the country. I've also put in the annual gigawatt hours of production, which is shown here, and then I've created a rate of jobs per gigawatt hour. What we see for coal, it's about 0.155 jobs per gigawatt hour. And then we see natural gas at about 0.18 and renewables at 0.663. And a lot of the renewables is the rooftop solar that's pretty intensive. So we see as coal goes away, we lose this rate, and then we gain in these other areas that actually have more jobs per gigawatt hour, which results in a net job creation. I don't want to minimize local community impacts. And I actually want to say personally, I've transitioned employment from where I was laid off from a company that was heavy in coal at the time. And today I work in the solar development space. And so I'm someone who's made that transition. I'm aware of what it's like. I'm not saying it's not even harder in some of these local communities, but this is what's in front of us, and it creates net new jobs. So in closing, I see the problem solved. HR 763 embeds greenhouse gas emissions upstream and then lets the market decide on efficient outcomes. On the technology front, it primarily relies on the existing technologies, which are deployed at massive scale. As new technologies come along, they'll be employed as well, but all this lowers cost and abundance. HR 763 will actually create net more US jobs, plentiful energy, and support a growing economy. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jim, see if we have some questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.